His corpse exploded inside the coffin, or so the legend goes. How could one of history's most powerful kings decay into such a gruesome end? What horrific chain of injuries and illnesses brought King Henry VIII to a death so terrible that even his coffin allegedly couldn't contain the horror? Welcome to a journey into the final days of King Henry VIII, a suspenseful, true story of royalty, ruin, and retribution. Henry VIII's death is more than just a morbid Tudor tale. It's a historically important turning point. His passing in 1547 marked the end of a tumultuous 38-year reign that changed England forever, from the Reformation to the fates of his 6 wives. Understanding how this once vigorous king met such a grisly end not only captivates our imagination with its shocking details, but also educates us about the harsh realities of 16th century life, medicine, and the consequences of absolute power. In this documentary-style account, we'll explore how Henry's own body betrayed him, through obesity, untreated diabetes, festering ulcers, and possibly even syphilis, driving him into madness and misery. By the end, you'll see why Henry VIII's death was as dramatic and dreadful as the life he led. Henry VIII did not always resemble the immobile, swollen tyrant we remember. In his youth, he was handsome, tall, over 6 feet, and athletic, a champion jouster, hunter, and dancer. Ambassadors praised the young Henry's vigor and great haste and agility. He was the very image of a Renaissance prince. But by the end of his life, that image had utterly transformed. The once muscular king ballooned into an ailing 300-pound tyrant whose paranoia and capricious whims sent many to their deaths, including 2 of his own wives. His waist expanded from a trim 32 inches to nearly 52 inches in girth. Instead of riding horses in dazzling armor, the aging Henry had to be carried everywhere in a special chair because he could no longer walk or stand on his own. How did this astonishing decline happen? The turning point came in January 1536. Henry, then in his mid-40s, suffered a catastrophic jousting accident. He was thrown from his horse and crushed beneath the full weight of his armored steed, leaving him unconscious for 2 hours. This was not Henry's first jousting injury. A previous accident years earlier had already left him with a wounded leg. But this was the worst by far. When he awoke, Henry's mood and health began to change dramatically. The injury reopened an old wound in his left leg, and this wound never properly healed. In fact, it turned into a chronic, festering ulcer that would torment Henry for the rest of his life. Little did the king know that this moment was the beginning of his physical ruin. Henry's joust injury forced him to give up the vigorous exercise he loved. No more jousting, hunting, or tennis. His leg was too damaged. The king, who once delighted in showing off his athleticism, was now often confined to chairs nursing his wounds. Unable to burn off his legendary feasts, Henry began to pack on weight. He drowned his frustrations in food and drink, indulging even more than before. The result was a spiral of decline. Less activity meant more weight gain. More weight meant more strain on his injured leg, causing more pain, which in turn kept him even more sedentary. It was a vicious cycle, and Henry was caught in it. The mighty king's body was starting to fail him, one painful pound at a time. And as we'll see next, the physical decay was only half of this nightmare. The other half was the way it twisted his mind. Henry's leg wound soon became an oozing ulcer that refused to heal. In fact, ulcers erupted on both his legs, not just the one injured in the joust. These open sores were deep, infected, and agonizing. The king's physicians were at a loss. In the 16th century, medicine was primitive, and the go-to treatments were often as brutal as the illness. To fight the constant infection in Henry's legs, doctors resorted to cauterization. They literally burned the rotten flesh with red-hot irons to try to seal wounds and stop the spread of infection. Imagine the pain, the smell of burning flesh in the royal bedchamber as Henry clenched his jaws in agony. And cauterization was not a one-time fix. His ulcers had to be reopened and drained regularly, a procedure done without modern anesthesia. Courtiers recorded that the king's swollen legs had to be lanced and drained of foul fluid to relieve the pressure over and over again. Pus and blood would seep out, the stench hanging in the air. It was gruesome and demoralizing. Despite these horrific treatments, Henry's ulcers never truly healed. They were chronically infected, sometimes so inflamed that he developed fevers. In 1541, an ambassador wrote that Henry's life was in danger, not from fever, but from the leg which often troubles him. The infection in his flesh was essentially poisoning the king day by day. Henry's once strong legs were now sources of constant pain, sometimes so bad he could hardly sleep. The royal doctors, in a misguided attempt at balance, even believed in keeping some ulcers permanently open, thinking it would drain bad humors from his body. Of course, this only exposed Henry to more infection. Every movement was torture, and it never stopped. The king's daily routine now revolved around tending to stinking wounds with poultices, bandages, and cauterizing irons. He had become, in essence, a prisoner of his own body, chained by unending pain. Yet incredibly, this was only one of Henry's many health problems. While the ulcers ate away at his legs, something else just as dangerous was happening inside Henry's body. A slow collapse under the weight of disease brought on by years of overindulgence. Henry VIII lived lavishly, and nowhere was this more evident than at his table. The king's appetite was legendary. Every day he feasted on up to 13 heavy dishes: swan, pork, rabbit, beef, and other rich meats, and washed them down with flagons of ale and wine. It's estimated that Henry consumed about 5,000 calories per day on average, including up to 70 pints of ale each week. This gargantuan diet, combined with his enforced inactivity after the jousting accident, caused Henry's weight to skyrocket. In his youth, he weighed around 180 pounds. By his late 50s, he likely weighed over 300 pounds. Contemporary accounts describe him in those final years as very stout and swollen in the belly and face. We might recognize this today as morbid obesity, a condition not well understood in Tudor times. With obesity came a cascade of other ailments. Modern historians believe Henry developed type 2 diabetes, though doctors of his day didn't have a name for it. The clues are there. His slow-healing wounds and ulcers, his excessive thirst and urination, noted in some records, and even the chronic leg problems. All classic signs of diabetes complicating vascular health. One analysis noted that as Henry grew fatter, his risk of hypertension and diabetes would have been extremely high. Indeed, diabetes would have worsened his circulation and immunity, making it even harder for his leg sores to heal. It's a cruel synergy. Henry's overeating made him obese. Obesity likely gave him diabetes, and diabetes made his ulcers and infections far more severe, accelerating his physical decline. Henry also suffered from persistent headaches and joint pain. He likely had gout, a painfully inflamed joint condition common in rich diets. His family had a history of it. Gout would strike his feet or knees, adding another layer of agony. Some reports also mention chronic stomach ache in his last years, perhaps ulcers in his digestive tract, or simply the toll of rich food and constant medicines. By his mid-50s, Henry's body was failing on multiple fronts. Infected legs, possible kidney and liver damage from overeating, alcohol, and constant infection. Heart trouble, vision problems, breathing difficulty under the weight of his mass. The list goes on. The King of England, who once prided himself on his virile strength, was now a chronically ill, morbidly obese man who could barely climb a staircase. His doctors were alarmed. They begged him to eat and drink less to save his health. But Henry was not one for self-restraint. He continued his indulgences even as they were killing him. As Henry's body deteriorated, so did his mind and temperament. Chronic pain and illness can change anyone's personality, and Henry was no exception. The sweet-tempered, generous young king had long since vanished. In his place emerged a moody, irritable, and often cruel tyrant. Historian accounts and medical researchers agree that around the time of his 1536 jousting head injury, Henry's behavior took a darker turn. Some speculate that the severe concussion he suffered, unconscious for 2 hours, might have caused traumatic brain damage, leading to mood swings and impulsivity. Henry himself likely didn't realize it, but he was becoming increasingly unstable and paranoid. The endless physical pain only fanned the flames of his temper. Day after day of excruciating pain can make anyone short-fused. Henry woke up each morning to throbbing, infected legs. He went to bed each night in the same agony. It's no wonder that contemporaries described him in these years as bad-tempered, unpredictable, and irascible. The once charismatic king now frequently lashed out at those around him. Ministers, friends, and wives alike felt the wrath of his frustration. In these later years, no one was safe from Henry's suspicion. He saw betrayal and treachery everywhere. The result? Heads rolled. He ordered executions with alarming frequency, including 2 of his 6 wives, Queen Anne Boleyn in 1536 and Queen Catherine Howard in 1542, on often flimsy charges of adultery or treason. One observer noted Henry had become a 300-pound tyrant, driven by capricious paranoia. Some of Henry's contemporaries whispered that the king's erratic behavior was due to syphilis, the dreaded pox of that era that in late stages can cause mental deterioration. It's true that syphilis was rampant in the 16th century, and untreated it can cause neurological damage. However, modern historians doubt this theory. There is no record Henry was ever treated for syphilis, which at the time would have been unmistakable. They used mercury rubs as treatment. None of his known mistresses or wives showed clear signs of it either. More likely, Henry's mental decline came from a mix of his brain injuries, possible cumulative effects of illnesses, like a chronic bone infection or even a rare blood condition, and the psychological strain of chronic pain and failing hopes for a healthy male heir. Recent research even suggests Henry may have suffered from a rare genetic disorder, McLeod syndrome, tied to his blood type that causes muscle degeneration and dementia-like cognitive impairment in midlife. Whatever the exact cause, one thing is chillingly clear. By his final years, Henry VIII was a man haunted, both by real physical torment and by inner demons. The stage was set for a final act that would be as dramatic as a Shakespearean tragedy. By late 1546, King Henry's decline was accelerating. He was 55 years old but looked far older. Historical accounts paint a sad picture. Henry was so obese and crippled that he could hardly move without assistance. He used wooden chairs on wheels to get around and mechanical hoists to lift him in and out of bed. He even had to be winched onto his horse when he wanted to ride, a far cry from the vigorous knight he had once been. Every step was torture, so often he took none at all. Courtiers whispered that the king's legs were rotting. Indeed, the ulcer on his leg was now the size of a man's fist and deep to the bone, continuously oozing pus and foul-smelling discharge. The infection likely went systemic at times, causing bouts of fever and delirium. Henry's hair had thinned, his eyes were failing, and he was plagued by constant thirst and digestive troubles, perhaps related to his diabetes and failing kidneys. It is said he wore padded clothing and furs to hide how bloated and sickly he truly looked, but there was no hiding it anymore. Henry VIII was dying. In January 1547, Henry took to his bedchamber at Whitehall Palace, never to rise again. The once mighty king was now bedridden, surrounded by physicians who could do little to ease his suffering. An atmosphere of dread hung over the court. Henry's temper was still fearsome, and even mentioning the possibility of his death was considered treason. For days, the king's condition teetered between life and death. Legend has it that in his final hours, Henry was plagued by nightmares and ghostly visions. One story claims he bellowed, "Monks! Monks! Monks!" while staring into dark corners as if seeing the spirits of the monks he had expelled and executed during the dissolution of the monasteries. Henry had destroyed dozens of Catholic monasteries. According to this tale, their specters came to torment him at the end. It's a dramatic image, the bloated tyrant king raving in terror at unseen phantoms. But it likely didn't happen quite that way. The more reliable reports tell us Henry became increasingly quiet and weak as the end neared. By the night of January 27, 1547, he was barely conscious, unable to speak above a whisper. Sensing the end, Henry's closest attendants finally dared to break the taboo. Sir Anthony Denny told Henry he must prepare for death. The king, perhaps for the first time in his life, accepted that his end was near. He asked for Archbishop Thomas Cranmer to come perform last rites. It was a frigid winter night, and Cranmer raced through icy roads to reach his king, but arrived after midnight to find Henry on the brink of death. The great lion of a king lay motionless in his massive bed, gasping shallow breaths. He could no longer muster his voice. In a poignant moment, Cranmer leaned in and asked Henry to give a sign that he trusted in Christ for salvation. Henry squeezed the archbishop's hand, a final act of wordless faith. In the early hours of January 28, 1547, King Henry VIII died. The royal doctors recorded the end as gentle. He simply slipped away. Modern historians believe he likely succumbed to multi-organ failure, kidney and liver failure, compounded by his obesity and infections. Some have speculated a final heart attack or stroke struck him in those last hours. His inability to speak could indicate a stroke. But whatever the precise mechanism, the result was the same. Henry VIII's turbulent life had come to a close. The king was dead. It was, as one writer later put it, a subdued end to a riotous life. But the horror of Henry's story wasn't quite over yet. What happened after his death provided one more grotesque twist, almost as if fate, or divine justice in the eyes of his enemies, had the final word. Henry's massive body was placed in a lead-lined coffin and taken on a grand funeral procession to Windsor Castle, where he was to be buried. The procession lasted 2 days, with thousands of mourners, guards, and horses trudging through the winter roads. On the night of February 14th, 1547, the coffin was laid in state at Sion Abbey, a monastery Henry had shut down years before. And here, the most macabre story of all unfolds. According to a centuries-old legend, Henry's corpse exploded inside his coffin that night. The story goes that pressurized gases from decomposition built up in his obese body, finally causing the coffin's seams to burst. In the morning, witnesses were horrified to find the floor of the chapel slick with the king's bodily fluids. Dogs were found licking up the blood and putrid remains that had leaked out. Those who despised Henry later whispered that this was divine justice, a fulfillment of a prophecy once preached against him. Indeed, a friar had warned Henry years earlier that, like the wicked King Ahab in the Bible, dogs will lick your blood as punishment. Now in death, the king's bloody sins seemed to literally come back to haunt him. It's hard to know how much of this tale is true. Some historians suspect the coffin did crack and leak, but the detail about dogs might have been embellished as propaganda to liken Henry to a cursed biblical king. True or not, the exploding corpse story cemented Henry VIII's reputation as a king so larger than life that even his death was grotesque. It's a story almost too lurid to believe, and yet it has persisted in popular history for centuries. What is certain is that Henry was buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor alongside his beloved third wife, Jane Seymour. In a twist of irony, the grand tomb he had planned for himself, adorned with Italian marble and splendid statues, was never completed. The great King Henry VIII was ultimately interred in a simple vault under the floor, almost unmarked for generations. It's as if even his grave was humbled by the ignominy of his end. Historically, Henry VIII's death had huge consequences. His 9-year-old son became King Edward VI, ushering in a dangerous power struggle among Henry's advisors. The England Henry left behind was divided, between Protestants and Catholics, between noble factions, and the succession was anything but secure. Edward VI would die young, and Henry's first daughter, Mary I, Bloody Mary, would restore Catholicism by fire and sword, only to be succeeded by Elizabeth I, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, whom Henry once desperately tried to disinherit. In short, Henry's death opened the floodgates of turmoil that his iron will had long held at bay. It also stands as a stark lesson: even the mightiest of kings are mortal, and no power or wealth could spare Henry from the horrible fate that his own choices helped design. As we conclude this dark journey through the final chapter of Henry VIII's life, we're left with a portrait of a once great king brought low by his own excesses and the cruel march of time. It's a story both cautionary and compelling, proof that truth is often stranger and more brutal than fiction. If you found this deep dive into history intriguing, please hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments. What aspect of King Henry VIII's decline surprised you the most? Do you think his personality would have been different if not for the accident and illnesses? We'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more fascinating history stories told in vivid detail. Thank you for watching. And remember, those who don't learn from the past are often doomed to repeat it. Stay curious, and we'll see you in the next video.